Moving on to our next panel quickly, women warriors. And prepare to be captivated by the extraordinary stories of women warriors in an engaging panel discussion. Our esteemed panelists, each deeply immersed in the narratives of these formidable individuals, are poised to bring their remarkable tales to life. May I please call upon stage our esteemed panelists, Nandini Sengupta and Tanvi Srivastava. The session will be moderated by Preeti Gill.
Good afternoon, everybody. And as our announcer, um, I think her name is Preeti as well, has just said, we look forward to a enthralling conversation, very different from the last one, um, but in some ways still the same because we are talking of these very brave, courageous warriors, uh, two women who lived in extremely different conditions, different times, different centuries, when the country was faced with also different kinds of problems because Nandini is written about a queen from medieval times, Rani Durgawati. This is her book. And she was a gaunt queen and uh, not only a fierce warrior, formidable woman, beautiful, and a great strategist. Some of that we will hear about today. And I would highly recommend that you should read the book because it has a lot of really charming and interesting anecdotes as well. The other book that we talk about, and the other woman warrior, again, barely a woman. She's so young. She's just in her teens, 17. She's also living far away from this country, born in Japan, in Kobe, and yet infused with the spirit of nationalism. Her parents are part of the INA with Subhash Chandra Bose, and this young girl is also infused with the same spirit of nationalism. And what Tanvi has done is to actually translate her war diary from Hindi. The diary was originally written in Japanese because that's the language that young Asha-San knew best. And then this was published in Hindi. And what Tanvi has done is to bring it out to us in English. So two very different times, two very different women, one fighting the nationalist cause, another a gaunt queen in medieval times. I wouldn't even call it India at that point. But extremely fascinating stories. So I'm going to start with some questions I think that will bring out a little bit of what the books are about as well. Um, so this one is for both of you. The reason why we write biographies. Why do you think this is such a critical genre? I've been working with feminist publishing houses. I've been with Kali for Women and then with Zuban, and always concerned about women's voices because largely they've been silenced and marginalized. And whether it's looking at women from, also regions that have not been explored before. So for me, this is particularly fascinating, the fact that, I've got to do a session with the two of you on these women. I'd like both of you to answer this. What drew you to this, this idea of putting the woman center stage?
I'll go first. So Lieutenant Asha, who was 17 when this photograph was taken, she's actually my husband's grandmother. And she's still with us. She's 95 years old. She's in Patna, and we'll play a small video after, maybe at the end of the session. For me, it was always very fascinating because I'd heard her stories in passing. She would say that, oh, when I met Netaji, the weather was like this. And we are always thinking, how accurate is that information? And she keeps bringing it up, but it's very hard for us in this generation, especially, to understand the enormity of that statement. And I also write fiction. So about 2 years ago, I was busy writing, and I came across an article by Jhumpa Lahiri. And in that, she said, no matter what you're writing, if you want to improve your craft of writing, try your hand at translation. Um, and as it happens, Lieutenant Asha's diary, which was published in Hindi, my father-in-law just gifted me a copy and it was just lying there. So I was like, okay, let me just pick it up, see how it goes. Um, and I was mesmerized. This was peak COVID. There were children at home driving me crazy. I would just lock myself up into the room and immerse myself entirely into this story. And when you're studying history, especially the way we studied history, it was always in CBSE textbooks. Nothing would really bring it alive. But the moment you read a person's first-hand accounts of living in Japan during the war, of meeting Netaji for the first time in 1943, of going up to him and saying that, yes, I want to join the Rani of Jhansi regiment, and just the entire journey of how she started off in Japan, went by train to Kobe, took these bomber planes which were targeted by fighter jets, met kamikaze pilots, joined the Rani of Jhansi training camp in Bangkok, and was at the forefront of the war. And you see this 95-year-old woman who's sitting next to me and trying to like make sushi at home. And it really feels like, can it be the same person? But when you read the book, it all comes alive. And that was the most, I think, most magical experience for me was that she was with us while I was doing the translation. So if I didn't understand anything, I would just go up to her, and her memory of that time was crystal clear. Um, so for me, it was really like Nandini was saying, serendipity. If I didn't find that article by Jhumpalari, if this book wasn't just right in front of me, I don't think any of this would have happened. And for just a woman who was so young, just to bring her voice back, um, I think it's just something that boggles my mind at times. It's such a powerful voice, and what's I think fascinating about this book as well is um, that it's the Japanese literary sensibility in her has also come across. So for as a fiction writer as well, I was just saying it's so beautifully written, but the story itself is so engaging. I really need to get it out into the world, get people to read it.
Um, so for me, as I was discussing with Preeti and Tanvi, that Rani Durgavati sort of reached out from the mists of time, and her story came to me while I was researching another book on animals of history. And when I came across her story, the reason why I found it compelling was that she seemed to me to be the most modern medieval queen I had ever read about. And she was so ahead of her time. And obviously, she was a warrior queen, so she had an impeccable record in on the battlefield. But even otherwise, just like Asha-San, I mean, Durgavati's life story starts when she falls in love with her husband, who is a tribal Gond prince. Remember, we're talking about 16th century India, and intercaste marriages were not very common. And here we have this young Rani Durgavati was a Chandel princess. Now, the Chandel bloodline was considered to be one of the most coveted Rajput bloodlines. And she falls in love with a tribal Gond prince, the Gond prince of Garha Mandla or Garha Katanga, Dalpati Shah. And against her father's wishes, she elopes and marries him. And there are some, if you read the book, you will find that there are some truly romantic stories of how these two teenagers meet. There's a very sweet meet cute, and how they go against conventions of the day and get married. So the first time she pushes the envelope is when she decides that she wants to marry the man she loves. And then fast forward 7 or 8 years later, when he dies, there is a lot of pressure on her from her brother-in-law, who was pretty much waiting in the wings to take over the throne. She has a little boy. Her son is a minor. He's about 3 or 5, depending on which account you're looking at. So clearly a minor, and he wants to play kingmaker. There's a lot of pressure on her to commit sati. And what does she do? She fobs off the brother-in-law, packs him off to exile. As long as she is alive, the brother-in-law never sets foot in Garha Mandla again. And she emphatically gives up Parda, anoints her son as the king, and takes over as regent, and manages her kingdom so efficiently, so well, that 500 years later, if you go to Jabalpur, which was at the heart of Garamandla, to this day, the tribal Gond population sing about her, sing about what a great queen she was, how well she managed her kingdom. Pure Rajma Sona ka Sikka. You know, she brought prosperity to her people. She brought happiness, and most importantly, she brought security. Over a period of some 15 years that she ruled, she had to face more than 50 skirmishes. She remained unvanquished in every single one of them except the last, in which she lost her life. So she was a remarkable woman. And for me, as a modern woman, and I would like to think of myself as a feminist, this was an icon I wanted to write about.
So from, of course, what you say, she sort of exemplified the Virangana tradition, which has already always been here. Um, it's just odd that one hasn't really heard much about her. She's sort of lost in the midst of time or whatever. The other queen, whether it's Ahilyabai or whether it's Rani Lakshmibai, uh, who was so present in our history books when we were studying, Asa, so much more heard of, so much more known. So what do you think is the reason really why Durgavati isn't so so easily recognizable as a name? And I'm also saying that, like we were talking earlier, having lived in Jabalpur, you knew that there was that Rani Tal, and you knew about the university being named after this queen. But apart from that, one really had no idea. And this time when I was in Bhopal, I saw this huge hoarding which said 500 years and Durgavati and all. So it's suddenly like you're retrieving your past history. What is the reason for this thing being lost altogether?
So, firstly, 2024 is going to be the 500th birth anniversary of Rani Durgavati. And so, therefore, it is a very, very important milestone. But I think there are three reasons why Rani Durgavati was forgotten by history and turned into a footnote in her own story. Number one, she was a woman. Indian history's male gaze is not unknown. If we look at all the greats, I'm not talking about historians here. You go out on the streets, you speak to the lay person, and whether it's Ashoka the Great or Akbar the Great, they are all men. And we have had a very long tradition of women warriors. We've had a very long Virangana traditions, but we've managed to sideline the characters that exemplified those traditions, and she has fallen victim to that. The second reason could well be because her kingdom was tribal, Gond, inaccessible in central India. Indian history also has a very peculiar Delhi slash Patliputra focus. If it didn't happen in North India, it didn't happen at all. And this is the reason why, because she came from a very extensive kingdom, I add, which was called, back then it was called Gondwana. Hers was the larger part of Gondwana, the northern Gondwana, but there were three other kingdoms. There was Deoghar, Kerala, and Garhakatanga. So we have a very extensive account of her kingdom, of her rule, but she became a footnote because, her people were tribal. It's an inaccessible part of India. It didn't happen in Delhi, so it didn't happen at all. Number three, of course, was that her adversary was none other than the Mughal Emperor Akbar. And given how much this character has been lionized in our history books, is it any wonder that she would be engulfed by the long shadow he casts on our history? It is interesting to note that there are two women who remained a thorn in Akbar's side all through. The first was Rani Durgavati, the second was Chand Bibi, and both of them have been forgotten.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. But I'm glad we have these books now, which are at least talking about these women. It must have been quite difficult for you to find the information. How much time did you take? Where did you look? And how were you able to dredge out all of this?
So this book is also a COVID baby. When I decided on starting the research, I assumed, just as you said, that there wouldn't be enough. But once I started doing the research, I realized that there was tremendous amount of primary source information about Rani Durgavati. And here I want to share something very interesting about her. one of the most complete accounts of Rani Durgavati's life and reign comes from a gentleman called Abul Fazl in his book called Akbarnama. Now, remember, Abul Fazl was Emperor Akbar's hagiographer. The Akbarnama was meant to be a hagiography of the Mughal emperor. Akbar was not only his master, he was also Abul Fazl's dear friend. And yet, if you look at the account that Abul Fazl has left in the Akbarnama of Rani Durgavati, he talks about her with extreme amount of esteem, if not reverence. And this is something that we see again and again in contemporary accounts of Rani Durgavati. We see that in the account that Ferishta, who's also a contemporary Deccani chronicler, we see that in the accounts of many of the Sanskrit secular and religious poetry of the time, people talked about her with a great deal of respect and reverence. And then there was another unusual source that talked about Rani Durgavati with some degree of information. These were the British civilians who were tramping through central India in the latter part of the 18th and mid 19th century. People like James Forsyth, people like William Henry Schliemann, people like Alexander Cunningham. All of these people were British civilians. Remember, when you look at their accounts of central India, you will see that the accounts are all age appropriately racist. These were Victorian gentlemen. They were here for a mission. They were here to propagate the British rule, British Raj in India. They had no real reason to talk in purple prose about a local queen. And yet, every single one of them describe Rani Durgavati's story with unabashed awe. And this is very interesting that the same people who are supposed to be her adversaries talk about her with such high esteem. And the more I delved into it, the more I found that there were these stories just sitting in plain sight. And then, of course, there are her people. Her people for the last 500 years have had songs written about them. And those songs have not changed in their tenor, in their tone in the last 500 years. She is likened to her namesake, Goddess Durga. And it's funny because I'm wearing red and white. As you can see, today is Ashtami. Today is the day we Bengalis invoke the goddess in her fierce feminine form. And here we are talking about two women warriors whom we have very nicely and blithely managed to forget. So it's a time for remembrance. So there are lots of primary, secondary, literary, numismatic sources, but the most interesting are, of course, the folk traditions about her.
So we can move to a time that is closer to us in history, and this diary that you've translated. Because again, this is also something which has been like a big gap, this whole thing of the women in the INA, because we really don't know. And I remember reading, and we had also published Lakshmi Sehgal's biography. So I remember that as one of the books and one iconic woman of that time. But there's really very little else by way of written documents. So for you, of course, the fact that you've got out this sort of diary, these narratives which otherwise would be completely lost because they fill a very important gap in the nation's history as well. And the fact that it was also being written so far away from the country. So, you know, where the the struggle for freedom had spread to all these places. But also that I find this interesting about your own connection to Asha-San. So if you would talk about both the things.
Perhaps you could just play the video once just to bring Asha-San to life. It's called the War Diary video, if we can play that as well. But at the same time, I'll just speak about it. So for me, discovering the Indian freedom struggle in East Asia, I think, was one of the big takeaways. When you actually look at it, if you actually look at the British intelligence reports, and sorry, we can start. We can start. So we have Lieutenant Asha here, who's my grandmother. Um, I still get goosebumps when I see this video. It really makes you realize that history is not 100 years ago; it's still around us, alive. Um, so for me, one of the big takeaways while doing research for this book was discovering how big and vast the movement in East Asia was, the Indian freedom struggle. Um, if you actually look at the Indian independence leagues that were the precursor of the INA, there were like 200,000 members across East Asia. Their families, the women that we're talking about who were contributing but may not have had their name up there. If you actually add it up, it would have been a movement of about 500,000 people actively involved in the Indian freedom struggle from 1920s to the 1950s. Um, and for me, what is really, really fascinating is the Rani of Jhansi regiment. Um, there was absolute silence about it post independence. Even within the family, we've asked Dadi, like, once India, one freedom, were you felicitated? Were you taken around? Was there any honor given to you? And she was like, no, I was very happy. I was very happy being a housewife, going to the club, forgetting about the past. And if you actually read the other accounts, it's a very similar narrative. There is a sense of shame also associated for women to be in combat at that time. There was this thought, and there's another book by Vera Hildebrand where she says that women who were serving with the Rani of Jhansi regiment, they often just went back to Malaysia, would just not speak about it. Um, and it was only much later that this sense of pride to say that, yes, I fought alongside the members of the INA, I fought alongside Netaji. Only in the last 10, 15 years, actually, has there been pride and the honor has come back. And it's always been very interesting. And I think you'll see it even today, like the resistance of women going into combat. Imagine in 1943, women wearing shorts is a big deal back then. So for these women to leave their families, to wear these clothes, to learn how to fight with machine guns, with bayonets, um, it was something that I think is just so remarkable. And I think the credit does go to Netaji to think that forward, to be able to say that, yes, I want to create a country that is egalitarian, and this is the way of showing it. Often people criticize the Rani of Jhansi regiment, saying that they weren't actually going for combat, it was just a propaganda tool. But if you actually look at the research of the papers, they were an infantry unit. They were trained to go into combat. The war ended before they could actually go there, but one platoon did go up to Burma, was about 100 kilometers from the border where the skirmishes were taking place. Um, so for me, it was to be able to give voice to all these voices that have been silenced. It was actually just quite a remarkable journey.
So two things more that how did she change? I mean, from being this schoolgirl in growing up in Japan, and then she goes off because she volunteers and she goes. She's so um, not just infused with this spirit, but also sort of excited. Her father's already doing it. All the talk in the house is about India and freedom, and of course, Bose is constantly talking. So at that point, like this was a young girl who went away training for joining the Rani Jhansi regiment. So what kind of changes would it have had? Because of course you can see the changes even when you read the diary notings, but if you'll talk about that, and also how difficult was it for the family to accept that, the fact that you're working on it and this is somebody in your own family, and how much do you keep back and how much do you reveal? Because that would also be a problem, no? I mean, oftentimes families don't want to tell everything.
Just coming to the second part of the question first, I think hats off to Lieutenant Asha's mother and father, both of them. So her father, Anand Mohan Sai, was working for the freedom movement from the non-cooperation movement. He was an associate of Dr. Rajendra Prasad here in Patna. When Gandhi visited Patna, he left his studies, joined the non-cooperation movement. And he actually got very upset with the fact that the freedom struggle had sort of come to an end in 1922 after the Chauri Chaura incident. And he wanted to do more. So he was actually wanting to join the Ghadar party in the US. and he couldn't get a visa to go to the US. So somebody told him that, why don't you go to Japan, and from there you can try to go to the US. And he said, okay, I want to fight for the Indian freedom movement in Japan. And that's how the family eventually shifted to Japan. But the one person I think who gets complete credit for the way Asha-San was brought up, for her sense of nationalism, is her mother. Her mother was someone who studied in Shantiniketan with Tagore at the same time as Tagore was there. She was the niece of Chitranjan Das, also marching through the streets of Calcutta, wearing her sari and just saying Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram. So when the entire family went to Japan, they were very active in instilling the sense of nationalism in the Indian expats in Japan. And there was a magazine that came, there was a photograph up called Voice of India. So they started a magazine, which her mother actually was the person behind it. And her father was traveling all over the place, away from home, doing same INA activities, but very often out of the home. So Sati was single-handedly not only managing this family, this house, but also helping with the movement in Tokyo. And for her to, she says in the book, she says that she wants her daughter to fight. She wants her daughter to pick up a gun and not chulha jalana or anything like that. It's for me, it's remarkable that I have young kids. I cannot imagine sending them off. At 15, she was saying, I want to go off to war. At 17, she actually went off to war. And it's very interesting as well, because Asha-san grew up in a very Japanese sort of way. She wasn't sent to an international school like the rest of the expats. She grew up in the Japanese national schools. And in Japan, that was a period of very heightened nationalism. So even though she had not gone to India, she was conflicted between these two cultures. But I think when she eventually landed in the Rani of Jhansi training camp and she saw how willing people were to fight, to give up their lives, to sacrifice everything for India, I think there was this big transformation that happened in her. And honestly, I think the biggest contribution of the INA was actually once the war ended and they returned to India. There's one photo of her father, her uncle, and Asha-san in her INA uniform. They actually went touring the country for almost a year, spreading the stories of the INA, of what was happening in Burma, sharing it with people. And through that, I think dissent spread. The Royal Indian Navy mutiny, for example, there was a lot of dissent within the armed forces. And I think for a lot of people, including my grandmother, who was a girl of about 13 at that time, she saw Lieutenant Asha in her INA uniform back in 1947. And for her, it was just such a remarkable scene as well, just to see a young woman in uniform, ready to fight, ready to sacrifice everything for the country. So complete, I think, a different mindset just by the formation of this regiment.
So I just got a notice here to say that we have to stop because MOS has arrived and we have to move. But before doing that, I've got to go do one more question, because we must tie this up with Rani Durgawati of long, long ago, because she was also quite amazing and started an all-women corps among the first in medieval India. Brief answer and then we can all move.
Yeah, so Rani Durgavati actually in a way is a predecessor of the Jhansi Rani Lakshmibai regiment, because she started an all-woman corps which was put in charge of looking after the her capital fort, which was Chauragarh. And I want to just take 2 minutes more to very quickly talk about how tactically intelligent she was. Her army was not as well trained as the Mughal army, because it was all handled by the local rajas, which were swearing allegiance to the king of Garamandla or queen of Garamandla. So the quality of the training was varied depending on who the commander was. And more importantly, they did not have cannons, and they did not have as efficient a cavalry as the Mughals. And yet she managed to vanquish every single one of those her opponents, because they used terrain very effectively. So this Jabalpur area is mountainous. There are craggy ravines and so on, and they used to lure their enemy into the ravine and put sharpshooters on both sides. And so the enemy would enter in a single file, and that's when the Gonds were they were expert archers. So then the archers would take them out, and that's how she managed to win. And in fact, in the the first half of the final battle of Narayanala, when she lost her life, that's exactly what she did. The Mughals could not bring in their cannons, because the cannons were big, bulky things, into the ravine, into that Narayanala defile. And she had already positioned her sharpshooters. And when they came in, they were decimated. 300 people died. And who tells us this? Abul Fazl does. So it's the Mughal chronicler who tells us that the first half of the battle was won by Rani Durgawati. She could not win the second part of the battle because that night she tells her generals, listen, we have to attack them at night. If we don't do that, tomorrow morning Asaf Khan will bring in the cannons into the defile and we will lose. And her generals refused to listen to her because they were, they had adrenaline pumping in their heads, and they said, we've just won a great victory against the Mughals. We're fine. And night warfare was not very common in medieval India. So we're going to fight them tomorrow. The next day, that's exactly what happened. So moral of the story is, no matter how smart you are tactically, sometimes you're let down by the men around you.
Thank you to both of you for fascinating accounts. And I'm sorry our session has been cut short, but
Yeah,
that's how it
we're
is.
sorry too about that. And what a perfect conclusion there, ma'am. Thank you so much for joining us. May I please request my team to present mementos to the ladies? Yes, we can clap a little louder. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.